Yeah. Mike says, yay. Okay, are we recording? Okay. Today is May 14. We have already done item 1.1 on our agenda, which was at noon, to review the Moab area parking workshop. And we recessed, so we are now reconvening. We are on agenda item 1.2. It is 5:03 p.m. And this is our workshop regarding hydrologic and hydrogeologic assessment of the surface water and groundwater resources. We welcome you, Ken Colm, back to our chambers. And I just want to throw out logistical info for us all. So Ken's got a 30 to 40 minute presentation that he'd like to go through and share with us. After that presentation, we are going to be introduced and hear just a bit from Jeff, our water attorney. And then we are going to get into the discussion about the report that you're going to give the report on. So report on, and welcome.
May I first introduce Paul Vanderhyde?
Hi, Paul.
My colleague and works with me, and he's very much a part of this, particularly when it comes to the water budget.
We're going to have you pull the microphone. There you go.
I can project.
Get him, Summer.
There we go.
Thank you.
And so Paul and I, the way we work this is I'll start in, but he'll jump in at
And you
various...
can pull it closer, actually. That might help. Then you don't have to.
What happens when I go up there? Am I in trouble?
You are.
We'll try and do it from here.
That's
but
good,
we'll see what we can do.
Okay.
Okay. So we kind of team tag as we go along in presentations like this. So we're used to this. And when it comes to questions, we team tag on the questions as too, because we sort of look at each other and say, do you want it? Do you want it? And, we'll go backwards and forwards and so on. So, Paul. Okay. So I guess I'm the driver. So real quickly, the project phases, the first part was the HESA. That was the phase 1. And everybody went, oh my God. But anyway, there it is. And you have that in your files. And I don't know if you've made it public yet. Have you made it public?
So what we have made public is what was published in our packet, which is your study findings. So
I think he's asking about phase 1.
Oh.
Does someone know? Is that posted somewhere on the website? Do you know Eve? Oh, Eve is nodding. She would know.
Yeah, it was in the packet for that meeting.
Okay. Can people go on the website and find it otherwise, or do you remember the date? Well, at any rate, it was in our packet at the time.
It is out there. Good. That's important. And then in phase 2 is based on the phase 1. We've developed a water budget for the area for the Moab City wells and springs. And that's an important concept because you're going to see we've subsetted from the HESA the important parts that affect just your springs and wells that were defined. And then finally, because we finished phase 2, we're now digging into phase 3, which is to protect your wells. And the well protection is already out there, and we're having discussions with Chuck as to how to approach what we've learned and what we know so that we can go ahead and modify as appropriately your well protection so you are protected. Okay, so that's phase 3. Okay. So we call phase 2 a preliminary water budget, and part of that is because as new information comes in, we should be able to modify that. We should keep that going. So this is our first approximation, if you want, of what is out there based on what is published and everything else. But as new data and information comes in, we encourage the city to keep updating the water budget so that we know what's going on, okay? And as part of this, we've already collected the hydrological and the hydrogeological and other data necessary to develop this. And you'll see some data is better than others. We'll talk about that. And then we'll develop as accurate as possible water budget, which we have done that, and we'll go into how we did that. And then we did something special, and the city was very agreeable. We went ahead and performed an aquifer storage evaluation, and this is kind of for you to decide just how sustainable you really are. This is really what this whole thing is all about. What kind of water is powering your system, so to speak, and what you have in storage. And That's beyond the initial scope. City said, do it, so we did it, and you've got the data for it, which is important information. You got it, Paul, thanks. So as part of phase one, this is where your well protection zones are right now. And they're all in the various hatched areas there. This is the figure in the phase one report, so you have that. Plus, we've made sure your engineers have these overlays, so they've got everything there. And from this, we delineated the study area boundary that you can see there. The roads are in red, but the study area boundary is in blue. And if you notice, it covers 3 drainages. And the next slide, Paul. This is important. This is the apples, oranges, pears, and plums. Okay, this is where everybody gets confused as to what we're looking at. If you talk mostly with your surface water rights people, this is the way they look at the world. And basically they say there's a Grand Staff system, they say there's a Mill Creek system, and they say there's a Pack Creek system. And you can see the outlines there, and those are the surface water systems, okay? The surface water systems don't necessarily, in fact, in many cases, coincide with the groundwater systems. This is the apples and oranges and plums and pears now, okay? So we'll start with this is the apples, right? This is the surface water system, and this is for our water rights lawyer over here to see what's going on. I'm throwing a hint over here because this is critical. And what you see on this particular overlay is we have the surface water outline, the watersheds delineated, which is based on runoff and drainages and such. And then the colors on there, which you're going to see on the next slide, are our groundwater systems. And if you notice, the two do not coincide. They have crossovers. So if we try the next slide, from our phase one, we delineated 5 major groundwater systems that service the area. So surprise, you're complex, you're not simple. That's the way most of the world is. 1A, 1B is basically all the glacial stuff that's sitting up in the mountains, and it's sitting on top of the red. The red is the Morrison. It's also sitting on the Mancos, which are our confining layers. So those aquifers are standalone aquifers. They recharge up there, and they discharge up there. And they all discharge into the watersheds, okay? From a protection point of view, this is something to remember. Now, 1A is the Mill Creek system affected. The 1B is the Pack Creek affected systems of those glacial and tertiary intrusive systems up there, okay? You know those areas where the aspens are, right? And everything up there in the mountains. That's how you can relate to that. The red you can relate to as you're going up the loop road. If you go from Ken's Lake, you start up the loop road, and the loop road goes like this, right? And the whole thing's breaking up with charcoal. It's on shale. And that's basically the Morrison, among other things you're going through. We care about the Morrison because it separates the upper aquifers from the lower. That's, again, for the water layer here. And the second part is any runoff, any surface runoff that comes through the Morrison will pick up a sulfate signature, which is, we're going to call it later, Pack Creek water. Whereas pure rainwater will have a bicarbonate signature, and that's what we're calling Mill Creek water, or Glen Canyon aquifer water. So see, we're apples and oranges now, so be careful here. All right, so then we come down to 2A and 2B, and we've had several questions on that. These are the alluvial fans that are Wilson Mesa and South Mesa, okay? They are their own little aquifer systems. Again, they're both in the Mill Creek watershed. And from a water rights point of view, they're in the whole watershed, right? Anything that goes on there is affected, but in our case, it affects us. It affects Mill Creek. Notice they're surrounded by Morrison all the way around. And so they discharge out and they become springs into the green stuff. That's key to remember, and we have that as an input in our water budget. We'll talk about that later. But what goes on up there from a water quality point of view, of course, is going to be very interesting to us as the land ownership changes and everything else. We want to know what's going on because it'll go right into the Mill Creek system. Am I okay so far? Everybody following me? Good. Okay. By the way, up in 1A, the biggest issue we have with the red in 1A is if the Forest Service decides to apply herbicides, we need to think about that, okay? Because that can get into our water supply and becomes a water quality issue. And so throw that in your hip pocket. Then we get to 3. 3 turns out to be what we're calling the Glen Canyon. And from our phase 1, we have learned that we can lump them all together. And they have various names. Navajo, Wingate, Kayenta are the 3. And we also put the Entrada in there. They're all sandstones or various forms. But the reason why we lump them together, besides the fact that the GS over the years has done that, is they're fractured. And the fracturing is what's going to make them connect. If you get them unfractured, they will not connect, and you will get springs out of each one of those layers. But in our system, they connect, at least where we're thinking of it. So 3 is what we call the Glen Canyon Aquifer. Notice how it goes into the Pack Creek watershed as well as into the Mill Creek watershed, and that's where the apples and the oranges get confusing. Notice we also have this black line between 3 and 4, and that is, you know of it as the Sandflats Road, but really we know of that as the Mill Creek Grandstaff Creek Divide. That's also a groundwater divide. All right, so the Grandstaff water is going to do its own thing to its own surface water. I'm going to the water rights person over here, right? Whereas in 3, all the groundwater in there is going to go into Rill, Mill, North Fork, whatever. Okay, it's going to go into that system and come out by the powerhouse. Okay, so they have 2 different exit points. Very important. Okay, 4, where's 4? Why can't I see 4?
4 is Grandstaff.
Oh, 4 is Grandstaff, thank you. Oh, 4, anyway. All right, 5. 5 is the system we're calling the Pack Creek system, and it is mostly in the Pack Creek watershed, but we have some of our Aquifer 3 floating into the Pack Creek watershed. That's important to note, okay?
I know we're not going to ask questions, but what is that boundary?
Between 3 and 5?
No, so in section 5,
Yeah?
see the upper 5 number, and there's a lot of colors and activity happening right there?
Right, on the west side?
No, yeah, and I know that there are springs, like
Yes.
Jackson Street and over there.
And the springs are in 5.
And that's from Pack Creek? That's not
Yes.
from like behind the rocks?
Yes, that's Pack Creek.
Okay, that's
Behind the
what I
Rocks
was
gets to
thinking.
go to Pritchett and Kane, and it comes out that way. You don't know that, but that's where it goes, okay?
So anything bubbling up on the edge of the cliff on the west side is actually
Pack Creek. And we took out the fracture zone, but there's a fracture zone that goes the whole length of the valley. And so that's actually recharged, we think, at the upper end of the valley where all those, where Pack Creek swings in and there's all the mining and all that. Those cracks probably recharge up there because they have a Pack Creek signature. And you come out and you look at the springs and they look like they're just out of the gravels, but they're not. They're out of the bedrock. But it has a Pack Creek signature. Isn't that interesting? We haven't really done an analysis on 5, and we'll come back to that, but we're hinting that if you want us, we will be willing to do 5. If you'd like a phase 4, we should do 5 for you. And then we can tie 5 to 3. Do you see what I'm saying?
There's development implications for that.
There
so-
is. We haven't touched 5, and you'll see why. By the way, on the left, you can't read it from here, or can you see all that? We list all the hydrogeologic units up there, and they're all defendable by the various literature and all that kind of stuff. And that's what goes with the color codes there. So, we have a little of our supposed aquifer on the top over there, but it's connected to the west. And everything that's on the east side of there is what we call bad actors. It's our Morrison, it's Chinley and Cutler and units like that, and they provide more sulfate water into those springs that you're talking about. So,
And so the Pack Creek is not the valley fill, it's the,
what's the fractures and the valley fill? Yes, it's both. It's a good point, and that's a good observation. Because like the east side, which has hydro stuff we're going to talk about, the west side has its own story, and we haven't done it yet, but we have a pretty good idea of what's going on. So we're ready to do it if you'd like us to do it. Only because you may have wells in the valley, and so therefore you probably want us to protect those wells too. All right, let's try the next slide. That's it for phase 1. Okay, that's your premium on phase 1. So now we move into phase 2. And based on what you saw, the 3, what we call the Glen Canyon Mill Creek system, GCMC system, there's the outline of where that system is that affects your wells and your springs, as in the city springs, the wells that are at the golf course, and Skakel. That's where we were tasked. We weren't tasked to do the one in the valley, so we were up there, all right? So we're doing all that. And if you notice, we're out of the Pack Creek Trench. We're not in it. Okay, does everybody see that? Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. Are we okay? Okay. So there's the study area, and there's the area it's hatched, and that's the area we're going to do the preliminary water budget for, and the hydrogeologic units, and that's the Glen Canyon group. So we've cookie-cuttered out of those 5 groundwater systems, the critical groundwater system that fits your wells and springs, and Skakel, and a lot of other springs that are along there too, because they're all part of your system. This is very important, and we picked it for several reasons. And one of the reasons is we could control the hydrogeologic boundary. That was the first thing. The other thing is we had data, and we'll talk about that in a moment, where we could actually defensively say where inputs and outputs were, and that becomes a critical part of the discussion here. But that's the cookie cutter, and that's the area that directly affects your wells and springs that are at the golf course and Skakel, okay? Notice nothing in the valley, okay, except for that little piece of golf course, and that's hydrogeologically comes out to that, but we're not in the Pack Creek system at all. We're all in the Glen Canyon Mill Creek system, okay? So we try the next slide. So the first thing we did to do that is we had to divide up to do this water budget area, we had to figure out where were the various hydrozones and the various boundary conditions, which you would call input and output to our system, and then the spring locations. So they're all on here. Now, this is a very critical piece, and I'll show you what it looks like in the field in a moment. But if we look at it, the green area are the phreatophytes. You know them as the water lovers. How about cottonwoods, willows, and anything else that goes with that, okay? So that gives you the basic definition. Stream bottoms, riparian, you know, that area. Spring vegetation, and so forth. You notice the greens pretty much along the main channels. So the green areas are our discharge function. When we do a water balance, what USGS did not do, and what we did do, is we said the phreatophytes are pretty major. And as you're going to see in our water balance, they're huge. If you thought you had a good pumping well, you ought to see what a cottonwood can do, okay? And of course, Phoenix knows this. They've been chopping them down for years, right, Chuck? Anyway, I mean, well, their habitat too. So you got, and shade and all sorts of other things. So you got other considerations there. Next to the green areas, you see the light green areas, which are known as number 2. Most of these light green areas are going to be what we call a French drain. Now, if you're very familiar with what a French drain is, if you have water running into your house, you dig a trench around it, right, and you put rocks in it, right? And the whole purpose is to attract water into those rocks and move it around your house and send it to your neighbors. Isn't that basically what goes on? Okay.
Would never do that, would we, Chuck? Not without permission, anyway.
Paul, you had that problem. Paul lives on a terrace level in Boulder, and he had some water issues, I remember, a few years back. But anyway, I don't have issues. Mine just runs off to my neighbors. Anyway, those green areas, think of them as French drains. Now, given the well data and other data that we have, these French drains, which start at about the cottonwood or bank level, go down as deep as 200 to 500 feet thick. And the width of the French drains are the width of the trench of the valley. This is a big part of your Lake Powell, so to speak, right? This is where water is storage. Groundwater is stored in here. And this is where a lot of your water, when it comes out of the mountains, it goes down into these French drains and it's in there, okay? But it's also part of what flows your stream, right? And it's part of what the cottonwoods are digging into and everything else. But we have well data that suggests that it's anywhere from 200 to 500 feet deep. And on any given width, it could be anywhere from 200 to 500 feet wide, okay? And so deep and wide and the length of the stream, you start calculating how much water is sitting in these things. You can't put a boat on it. You can't put a summer home on it, but this is one heck of a reservoir, okay? Has everybody got that concept in mind? Okay, that's the green areas. You see they start right where Mill Creek comes in, and they go all the way the length of Mill Creek, all the length of the North Fork, part of the other rill and that system up there, and then you see it comes out at the powerhouse. Notice how it doesn't touch most of your springs or wells, okay? So that's part of the interpretation, but that's the green area, okay? That's the riparian fracture zone. I'll show you pictures of that shortly. We look at 3. 3 is what we call the matrix area, and the USGS did some nice drilling in the matrix areas, and they said, oh, the water's old and very tight. Well, we agree. It's very, very slow, and water takes its time. These are the areas in purple. And if you notice, they're the areas that basically define to the east of Johnson's Up on Top is a 3. Okay, and then if you notice, all the area to the east of Johnson's Up on Top is a 3. Most of the area that's to the south is a 3. Most of the area from the Grandstaff Divide, except for where the drainages are, is a 3, okay? So this is where water moves in very slowly. It can be stored, but the storage won't be very great, okay, because it has very low pore space. And the big key on it is it's not highly fractured. That's the key. So the purple area is not an area that has a whole lot of storage and a whole lot of, it's slow moving. All right, is the way to think of it. All right, you look at 4. There's not many. 4 is the light blue. And if you notice, it's mostly up against the Entrada and the upper Navajo there along the mesas. And there, these are what we call the dry wash. But these are areas where it can rain, it can recharge, but you don't know where the water table is. The water table's down in, but it's highly fractured. So if you get a good rainstorm up there and it collects it down into there, you'll get a good recharge function out of that. And you can get a good storage function out of that. Okay, but we just don't know where the water table is because there's no phreatophytes, so we know it's below 50 feet below the surface. We know it's somewhere down there, but it's not there. Okay, and then the other critical is number 5, and 5 is kind of that orange-colored area, and 5 is highly fractured aquifer. Okay, this has your highest movement of water, your fastest movement, and the best storage. And notice that all your springs are in it, and so are all your wells. Guess what we have to protect? Okay, so everything there in orange, not everything, but that's going to be a pretty good starting spot for phase 3, because where the orange is going to be your maximum water, and it's going to be your fastest transmission. We call it, well, it's called permeability, but we have a different name for it, hydraulic conductivity. But anyway, that's the velocity of the water is going to move fastest there, and the amount it's going to store there. It's your youngest water. It's the water that will flush out the fastest, and it could be the easiest to contaminate.
It's hard to tell without a satellite overlay where that boundary is delineated.
We will get it to you. Okay. Phase 3. I'm teasing you. This is just so you know ahead of time where we're going with this.
In the presentation.
In the presentation. Yeah. Okay. All right. So does everybody have a good feel for this? Paul, do you have anything you want to add? You're all right? No. Yes. Okay. All right. So let's go for the next one then. All right. So those are our hydro zones. Okay. From this, we go ahead and we put on the wells and the springs. And you can see that the most successful wells and springs are in our most highly fractured areas. Just for kicks, we also put on the Gwissa wells, and they're the little yellow dots. You see them going down there. And you see the little orange connection that goes all the way down heading towards Ken's Lake. We don't think they're connected to our system, but we put them on anyway. And by the way, we did another insight as to that little orange thin layer, which comes from 2007 Low and others, and they identified the orange layer as good water quality, and everything just slightly out is back to the Pack Creek water quality. So where it's not exactly in our system, we thought we should show this because it's in some way directly related, and we call it the diversion and the leaky Ken's Lake. We'll call it that in a moment. But if you take a look at where Ken's Lake is, go up along the orange, that is a fracture zone. And we don't have the pre-1980 data. We haven't looked at it yet, but the post-1980 data says, this is good water. Thank you, Ken's Lake. And basically, the irrigation district who owns Ken's Lake, right, and Gwissa might have to have some discussions. I'm just saying this to our water lawyer over here. But that doesn't affect us unless we worry about, we have one water in the valley, but we haven't assessed that yet, okay?
So you're saying that Ken's Lake is leaking and it is fingerprinted to be the city?
The county's not, it's the same quality as the city because it's Mill Creek water. See, it's water that comes through the diversion.
So with respect to water rights or whatever,
Not in our, yeah, that's up to how he wants to talk about water rights on that. But basically, in the physics of things, it was part of our system until we diverted it out. And they have an older water right, I guess. So therefore, they took the water out and they stuck it in Ken's Lake in 1981, somewhere back in there. And then from then on, it's leaked like a sieve, and they've done various things to try and stop it, but I think we have a 2018 report as to how much they think it's lost, and it's huge. So there's a tremendous amount that goes in every year. May not be a bad thing for the county, but it's not something we need to worry about for us. If they pump those 3 wells, they won't touch us, because our water is coming from across Mill Creek right there in the Cross Valley fracture. It's not coming down that part of the fracture. So
that northernmost yellow dot, is that Chapman, for example? And you're saying
yes,
that's
and George White, Chapman, and Spanish Valley, I believe.
sourced largely now via Ken's Lake as opposed to the fracture zone to the north?
Yes, it never was coming from the fracture zones to the north.
Okay, so when we, okay, because it's up.
We believe.
That's the base, I mean, because you've told us how this fracture zone on the west side of all this extends all the way down to Skokel. But these wells here, because they're higher than the city wells are, they're not hitting Glen Canyon.
So let me help you out here. I'm glad you asked the question. The fracture zone has different hydrologic responses to where you are on the fracture zone. That's the way. It's not all doing the same thing. Sometimes a fracture zone is a high K zone or a pipe. That'll be the Skakel story. Okay. Sometimes it'll be a block, and that's actually our city wells and springs, because the water is coming on a cross valley fracture there where it's orange, and it hits the fracture zones, and it can't go anywhere, so it comes out of springs. Okay, so that part of the fracture is a block against what's happening to the valley. The next piece by Johnson's up on top is back to being a pipe again, but it was probably a Pack Creek pipe until we put in Ken's Lake, and now it's a Glen Canyon water quality pipe, but it's part of the Pack Creek system.
Yeah, so Chapman, for example, is it down gradient then from the city's wells?
Not even connected.
Not even connected?
Not even connected. We won't affect them and they won't affect us. We can test that out. But basically, they when they did Chapman, they went in within an hour or two. They hit their boundary condition, which is the fracture zone, and they put their well was in the, just like the San Juan County well further up. And they put it into the fracture zone and they hit it.
Really interesting in this area.
So we can work with you on the water rights, as this whole thing is a screwy. But important for the city to know is Chapman and those don't affect us. Even though they have their well protection zones going over to Mill Creek like us, we don't believe they're getting our water. We think they're getting water from further southeast. And that's the good news. Yeah, the other thing Paul wants me to show you is we chose these because look at the boundary conditions, and basically they're in the white letters around the edge. And we tried to put it where we'd have in steady state, hopefully in transient as well, no flow. And so if you see the no flow all the way around, we've got it with the exception of right where you see it says springs there on the right-hand side, roughly where the North Fork is going up through the light blue area there. And that's the spring water that's coming out of those mesas, then goes into our system there. Okay, so that's the connect between those, on your other figure 2A and 2B, from those two aquifer systems, that's where they get into our system there. The other boundary condition that's important to see is look at Mill Creek down there in the lower right-hand corner, and there's a little bit of groundwater, but mostly it's surface water that's coming in there. And in the realm of protection, yes, it's something you want to worry about because everything that comes in there is going to become your recharge further down. Not all the water, but a percentage of that will become recharged into our springs and seeps. So we are worried about water quality there and quantity. Okay, no flow on the end. Then we come and you can see one of the outflows is diversion. We're going to use that as an outflow in post-development rather than pre-development. We'll have that discussion in a moment. In pre-development, the diversion didn't exist. Okay, so pre-development, it's all just Mill Creek. Mill Creek goes in the orange area, it leaks and goes over to your springs and wells. The rest of Mill Creek keeps going. North Fork comes over, comes across the next fracture. We call it the powerhouse in that area, right? And then picks up the Kayenta Fault Zone and recharges Skakel and all those other springs that are along that line there. Got to move on. I'm told I've got to move on. So here's what it really looks like, okay? You want to see what a French drain looks like? This is what a French drain looks like, okay? So you look at the bottom, and you can see a drainage in there, and you see the phreatophytes, the water-loving, the cottonwoods, all those plants. They're in the bottom, the stream bed there, okay? Then the whole trench from side to side, that is your French drain, okay? So there's the width, and then the depth is whatever the wells are tell us, so it's the best we can do. So 200 to 500 feet, depending on where we are deep. The top of it would be, of course, the land surface down below, right? That would be the top. And then, so there's your width, and your length is the length of the whole stream here. So Mill Creek is your reservoir, among others. So is the rocks above it, but it's your big reservoir right there. If you look at Johnson's up on top to the left, that's category 3, or what your matrix. And what's interesting about that is the southern portion of that, where the Jeep road goes up high, and you walk along and you see things. That portion there is actually glacial gravels on Entrada, which means as you get down to the bottom of the Entrada, not being fractured, it has a impermeable zone. So the top of that part of Johnson's up on top, pretty much the water's going off to the sides. Not doing a whole lot of recharge there. And yet, if you look down below, that's where Ken's Lake is and all that action's going on. But anyway, we're not getting a lot on Johnson's up on top. Here, it's something else. You look on the right, and that's your category 5, all right? So there's your fractured system there. It becomes sand flats. That whole area would be your category 5, which has your matrix and your fractures all working together to be a great storage zone. And if you look all the way at the end of that picture there, you'll see those vertical fractures right there. Of course, that's your French drain, but that's your cross valley fracture that comes out to the city springs and wells is right there. We call it Spring Canyon. You know of it as where Steel Bender comes out, okay? That is your cross valley fracture zone. So if you want a good look at it, just go over Steel Bender, drop down there, you'll see Spring Canyon. You can see where that comes out to, and that's heading out to your city springs and wells. Okay, I only have a few more minutes, right? I'll hurry, and then we'll go for questions.
So Ken, you said these fractures are 200 to 500 feet deep, and people literally go out there and core them, and
They have for 2 wells. And those are the 2 in-holdings, which are right in this picture. Maybe, yeah, see the in-holding in there? One of those is, maybe it's further up, but those 2 in-holdings have the wells, and they're the 200, and that's the best data we've got. Again, there's your one. Does that look like a French drain to you? Isn't that interesting? But it's not from the land surface, it's from the surface down at the bottom, down,
when they're coring them, if you're drilling through solid rock, you're pushing on the drill bit. I'm thinking about my drill bit in my hand, all right? And then all of a sudden,
but not even solid rock, it's fractured.
Fractured?
It's highly fractured.
And
It's filled with sand and maybe some gravels. Oh yeah, they'll have no trouble going down that because it's all broken up.
That works, I don't know.
Well, take a look. Well, yeah, and take a look. You can see the fractures right there, okay? And then that's Johnson's up on top to the right. And that's your matrix right there. So that kind of gives you a feel what the categories look like. So here comes the water budget. And this water budget will just go by quickly. Are you all right? Have we meat-glowed yet, or are we okay?
It's just like those past 2 pictures, like we're talking about something like pretty
Want to go back?
scientific-y. They're so pretty. The pictures are so
They
pretty.
are.
I was just reflecting, gosh, we live in such a beautiful place.
So sometime I'll tell you a story about the first time I saw the Tetons, and now, the first time you see it, you go, bleh, and then you analyze it to death, and then you have to come around to that again. You got to come all the way around and say, okay, I understand it, but it's still amazing, and then go on it from there. That's a pretty amazing feature. That really is. Not only hydrogeologically, it's just, what a landscape, right? What a landscape. All right, let's try the next slide, sorry. So this is the way we break it out in terms of from that figure you saw, all these features are on that figure, okay, in the way, so we won't dwell on this, but it's in the report, and they tell you your input and output. And so what we did is we've gone and we created a preliminary hydro budget based on each one of these hydro zones. We've given them numbers, And in the numbers, if we go to the next slide, Paul, you can't read that. But basically, we give them all the 5 category types. We go into whether they're recharge or discharge. We calculate how much, and there's ways we identify how we do all that. This is just to show you we've got all the numbers, okay? So, all right. So from this point then, now to how do we do a preliminary water budget? And here's what we did. And I will tell you why we did this. We did 2 pre-development and we did 2 post-development. And pre-development we called pre-Shealy diversion. And post-development was after the Shealy was in place to today, okay? And the reason why this is critical is the Shealy diversion is the single biggest change in your system. Everything else is there, but I mean, that's the single biggest human change in this particular system, not in the valley, up in the Glen Canyon system, okay? That's the single biggest change. We do this because in pre-development, we can calibrate to what input and output is, and then we can do a post-development water budget, and that tells you how much you've used. Okay? And so that gives, and where does it come from? It comes from groundwater. It means how much groundwater have you already taken out of your storage since 1980 on a yearly average, okay? So we'll talk about what that really means, but that's why we did that. And what we did is we have 2 very tough things to estimate. One is what does the water-loving plants do? That's the low and the high estimate for consumptive use. And the second thing is how much recharge is really going into your system. And that's a tricky one because that's climate driven and that's where your climate change comes in, although it comes in all over the place, right? It's in there or there. So there we have the pre-development and then we have the post-development. And when we use the term closing term, it means that recharge is our least defendable piece. So we're trying to use the most accurate of everything else we have, and recharge is what we're bringing around to close out what the water budget really looks like. Once we get that into pre-development, then we can use the same recharge in post-development and see what we've used for groundwater. That's really what we're trying to do, okay? Confusing, very technical, go for it.
The Shealy is the
Ken's Lake.
waterfall, Ken's Lake.
Ken's Lake.
Okay.
And Faux Falls, very good. Where Steelbender goes in. Poor Steelbender gets to be the boundary condition. No, just kidding. Anyway.
One comment that I like to make is that the recharge in the pre-development is used as a closing term, but actually we did the checking against some calculations that we could make with numbers of percentages of how much precipitation actually recharge in the various kind of rock that we see here. There has been studies in other areas, so we have a pretty good handle on that rate of precipitation going into the rock and the maximum rate that it can do. And so we have used those calculations to check the closing term in the pre-development. So it's not just an end number that comes from, but it has some defensible underpinning.
Right. So we don't have Lake Michigan, right? You know, we have something reasonable. Yes. Okay. So we developed 4 of these tables. You can't read them, and why don't we come? Well, how much time do we even spend on these?
Well, we're kind of at our
You're at our limit.
end
Okay.
here, so, I mean, of what we were hoping to like stick to a 40 minute.
Okay, because this is the end. We don't
This
have
is
much.
the end. Oh, okay.
Well, we have the storage story too. We have these calculations, and so just trust us that we know all those. There's some pretty important numbers that will come out of this. We'll talk about what they are later. Okay? Is that good? Or do you want to point out a few things here real quick?
Will we do that in the conclusion?
Yeah, we'll do it in the conclusions of why these are important. But we have 2 sets of pre and 2 tests of po, and those are all the conditions that we're testing against, and those are all of our calculations right there. So we can go through those. Okay, so here's a couple important things to get out of this. First of all, the city wells and springs production numbers are some of our best data. So we use that. The discharge from non-city springs based on the approval, this is state water rights numbers. So that's where we take that data from. Who knows if they use it all, but this is what they have, okay, or what they can use. The non-city, Paul can speak on this a little bit better. Non-city wells discharged based on approval of diversion and water rights database. Again, same thing, okay? And we're comparing it. We learned how they do this through Castle Valley, so we're doing it for Moab the same way. We learned from them. The Mill Creek flows are based on 2 USGS gauges at locations of the Shealy diversion, and they're extrapolated along Mill Creek using the data from Blanchard. Now, the important thing about Blanchard is it was a one-shot deal. They went through it, and they were answering the groundwater question, and we really like that. It was good. But if you're doing an annualization on this thing, it's a one-day, one-shot deal, okay? But it gave us some hints as to what's going on. That's what was important. And note that the lower Mill Creek inflow above Shealy diversion in post-development is due to the upstream runoff decrease. So do you want to speak to that a little bit more, Paul?
Well, basically, because when the Shealy diversion started, there was significant less water in Mill Creek on an annual basis. And so we used that rate between the pre-Shealy diversion and the post-Shealy diversion, the rate at the diversion of the water that went through into Mill Creek to modify the runoff in lower Mill Creek, the flow that actually gets out to Spanish Valley. Basically, this means this particular comment relate to the process that we used to come to a lower Mill Creek outflow in the post development water budget.
Which is a decline, as you're going to see. Okay, let's try the next slide. This is pretty significant here. So as we go through this, when we look at pre-development in here, and people say, well, do you have LaSalle Mountain water? The answer is yes. We have LaSalle Mountain surface and groundwater, and it's responsible for 45% of what you are getting in your wells and springs. So we're not saying that's not insignificant. It's, when it comes to protection, it's another game. The rest is coming from directly from recharge, from precipitation, or ephemeral channel loss right in your system. So the sand flats in that whole area there, 55% of your water is coming in there. Okay, that's pretty amazing, isn't it? And you're like, that's a desert, right? You're going, really? And the answer is, well, yeah, it's fractured. It's got sand on top, and it just takes the water and brings it right in. Post-development, in this case, surface water from LaSalle Mountains is less. It's now only accounting for 41% of it. And the local recharge from the precipitation is now 54%, but notice, the groundwater released from storage since 1981 is about 5% of your aquifer. Okay? Finally, the next thing, these are kind of bottom lines, they come into here. So you've declined your aquifer about 5%, mostly because Shealy diversion has taken it and put it into the Pack Creek system. It's taken it out of your Mill Creek system and it's put it into the Pack Creek system. That's the key here. So the question is, how much more do you want to let go out of your system? Okay. Shealy diversion depletes, here it is, 22% of the total inflow of the system. That's pretty significant, but they have an older water right too. Anyway, resulting in 40% reduction of the Mill Creek outflows towards the Spanish Valley and 20% reduction of springs and seeps. So that's a pretty critical change since 1981. Okay? Just want you to sink that in a little bit, okay? It's not just
No
telling
pun
you where,
intended.
just telling you where, yes. Thank you. Oh, that's a beer seep. No, anyway. All right, and so the other thing we wanted to point out is what data is certain and what data is uncertain and how can we improve on this? And this goes through the different pieces of data types. We're probably out of time to go through this, so we won't go into it. But the bottom line is the USGS flow data And the NOAA climate data is some of the finest data we've got. That's the best data we got to work with. Most of the other data becomes what we call snapshot data, and we only get one shot in time. We're glad we have it. We've learned a lot about the system from it, but it's a day versus a year versus many years. And then the third piece is most of the discharge measurements that we're using from the Utah Water Rights Database, which basically tells you what they can take out, but it's not necessarily what they are using today. So some of our values could be there accordingly. Here's the big uncertainty. Consumptive use, which we do have studies which tells us how much these cottonwoods take out. So we have that based on the studies, particularly from the Matheson wetlands and then other Utah studies. So that's where we get that data. And then finally, one of the biggest uncertainty is the water well usage from residences, homes, gardens, who knows what that really is. And so and that's what we learned from Castle Valley and others, is what do we do to come up with an estimate of that. So that just tells you where we're uncertain in all this. Okay, now, finally, storage. This was not originally part of the study, but I think you're going to find this important. So here's our 5 hydro zones. So everything that's green, number 2, everything that's orange, number 5, and everything that's blue, light blue, number 4, these are your highest reservoirs. These have your highest storage, okay? They also have your highest velocities. Okay, so they're your flushed and they're the ones out. The ones that are purple are your matrix. They have your lowest storage, your older water because it's not moving very fast, and things like that. And just to point out, notice Johnson's up on top, it's in the purple. Notice that the other area to the east of it's in the purple, and then most of the other purple is sitting up there by Upper Rill where the Grand Staff, where the Sand Flats Road is going up over the top. Most of the high storage areas are right near your wells and springs. So this is very critical. So when it comes to, protecting them, we're looking at those areas in orange and those areas in green very carefully. And those are the areas that we need to protect, okay? Try the next slide. This tells how we calculated it. We'll skip this. We'll go on to the next one, but you can see it has all sorts of engineering calculations and whatever. Here's the significance. So these are big numbers. The calculations show that the variable storage in your system, this is your reservoir now, range from 153 roughly thousand to 306,000 acre feet across the entire area. Now think I should have found what reservoir that would be. Now it's not Lake Powell, but you get the idea. This is a pretty big reservoir sitting in there. Now that's not necessarily usable storage. That's just the power of your system. That's your sustainability. And most of that is there because it can't evapotranspire, right? It's in there, it's locked in there, and it does things. The thing to remember about that first number, though, is it also powers your hydraulics, and we'll get into that in a moment. If you deplete that, the first thing that might go might be your stream flows, and then the next thing that might go will be your springs. And once your springs are starting to deplete and go out, then that's when we call it mining. That's when we actually mine the groundwater. So this is not necessarily water you have to go put in wells and do things, okay? So we don't want it to be, and they learned that from Cedar City apparently. So we don't want to do that. But this is the power of your system. This is the power. We got a pretty damn good system up there, right? The low end is for the lowest specific yields and for the lowest velocity. So 153,000 acre feet, all right? So think about that. Most of the storage sits in hydro zones 2 and 5, which is where your wells and springs are, okay? And where Mill Creek is, okay? And that range, let's just deal with, Paul, the low range. Let's deal with the 38, with roughly 39,000 there to the 61,000. So you add those two together, and that's storage that's relatively close along the critical flow paths that go right into your wells that we protect. They're right in there, okay? So those are two critical numbers. The next bullet point there, in the post-development water, we noticed that given the outtake at Shealy, which is roughly from our first calculation at 65 acre feet per year, notice that we have a deficit of 873 acre feet per year that is removed from groundwater storage. on a given normal year. Now, you can have a wet year that'll fill it up and a dry year that'll take it down, okay? This is all average annual. That's all it is. But it's something to think about. If we just dried it forever, we can figure out how many, take the 873 and divide it into the 150, whatever, and that's not even a good way to do it. But it gives you an idea that you got a few years. You don't have the red light on at this point. But you got to think about things, you know, that kind of thing.
I'm gonna,
Go ahead.
if we have time to talk about this is a critical issue, sustainability. Utah law requires sustainability. Chuck and I have already had an animated discussion about what's sustainable. Do you mean it's sustainable for a few years, for a decade, indefinitely, whatever? I maintain that the fact that we're already, by these estimates, which are admittedly preliminary and they could change, we're already on the downhill side and we've got a lot of growth to compensate for. To just say, oh, we still got plenty of water is really short-sighted. Yeah, that's my opinion. So this is an issue I would like to further address.
And you're saying that because of this, like, deficit?
Correct. Yeah, in other words, if we were on an average year coming out with zero loss, we wouldn't necessarily have to have a gain, but it was zero loss, and I'd be way more comfortable. That, by definition, would be sustainable.
That's sustainable, right.
But a small loss, sure, it's not a problem. There's nothing to, as Arnie put it so well the other day, there's nothing to worry about. Nobody needs to panic. But I don't want to just blow it off either, because, I mean, this reminds me a lot, if I may use this analogy, of hotels in this town. I mean, 6 years ago, you know, we said, oh, there's a lot of hotels coming, but don't worry, we still got a lot of room. And now here we are finding ourselves up against the wall. I don't want to find ourselves up against the wall years later, finding out that, gee, we really pulled a significant amount of water out of this aquifer, and now somehow we've got to make up for it. And that's very difficult to do.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. So this is based upon the water rights, not use, correct?
Oh.
That's correct.
And we're not fully utilizing our water rights, as I understand it.
Nor may all those other water rights, all those other values. We don't know. We just have their number, and that's what they're entitled to use at any one time. So, I'm correct, Paul?
Yeah,
Am I saying that right?
it is. These calculations are not based on water rights as they exist. These calculations are based on the physics of the system. So this is, we like to make sure that that there is an understanding that there is a difference between the water rights that you have and that others have, and what the system does. This really talks hydrology. The movement of water in the system. Apparently the city isn't using the full water rights that they have for these springs and wells. The question is, even if there is enough water in the system, can you technically get to all that water? So that's another issue that again, is not per se a water right issue. It's more of a scientific and technical question. Do you get to all that water that is here in this particular area, and can you pump it out?
Because right now we're just using, when we say that that this 873 acre feet is removed from groundwater storage, how are we removing it? What is the logistic of that removal?
Basically, what this means is that there are a number of discharge, as we call it, discharge types. You have the flow out of Mill Creek at the lower end of Mill Creek into Spanish Valley. You have the springs that take water out of the system. You have wells, both city wells and private wells that take water out of the city. And all together, and including the diversion to Kent's Lake, all together are responsible for the deficit. So it's not just the city is responsible for the deficit. From our scientific, technical point of view, we cannot point fingers who is responsible for most of it. It's the total, for the total area. If we look how much water comes in and how much water goes out, we see that deficit, and the only way to make up for the deficit is taking it out of groundwater storage.
But, I mean, nature's gushing it, we're catching it. Nobody's, I mean, unless you're talking wells.
Right.
So the wells are what are, like if we were just existing off of our springs, then we would be sustainable. So because we're pumping from wells,
Well,
or am I oversimplifying that?
well, there are different, if you want to try to manipulate the system, any well is the easiest way to manipulate the system. But you can also try to enhance recharge into the aquifer. You can try to basically increase any of the inputs if that is possible, or reduce outputs, except that your springs go dry, or certain springs go dry. Of course, the Chile diversion to Kent's Lake is a big one there too.
Yeah, Caitlin, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but to answer your question, I think what I heard them say was, in terms of measuring discharges, that for springs, they assumed, from the water rights numbers, they assumed that all the springs are flowing at the water rights values, because they can't really measure it very easily. Actually, the city does have some data on that. In terms of wells, I suspect that what they said was you guys used the water rights numbers, then you modified them for what you thought was actual uses. Is that correct?
Yeah, they actually did a study and had devices to meter the actual use of the large number of wells in Castle Valley for a period. So for the permanent households, they actually measured the actual use and compared that with the water right use, and came up with a rate that they used, that the state actually used in their first water budget for Castle Valley. So that particular rate we used to apply to the water rights numbers for the private wells in our area, and so we got to that.
Yeah, that'd be a very difficult number to get.
Were they
Well,
similar?
excuse me?
Were they similar? The rights
Well,
and
you
the
have
road?
a different number of wells, so the rate is different, and also you have different type of private wells. So some wells are just for drinking water. Some water is for limited watering of gardens, and some are including some cattle or watering. And in this particular study, the irrigation wells in Castle Valley were excluded. That was a separate entity. So we see that in our area you have also some of these differences. So some have a maximum of 15 gallon per minute that you can pump out, and some have like 40 gallon per minute, or other measures that compare to that. So we used those differences and look how many wells there were, and then we made our calculation based on that. So the difference is not in the rate of consumption, as well as what type of wells and how many of the different types are in our area versus Castle Valley.
And these are just the wells in the Glen Canyon aquifer, not in the valley.
Right.
It's 6:02 right now. Are there any more slides, or is this the final slide?
That's pretty close. Let's see.
Oh, yeah, this was like,
We've
well,
done
hold
this.
on, go back one, because that was kind of like the
the conclusions of the water balance.
I mean, I'll be honest, when I read this, did you guys were you looking for this number? Yeah, I was like, maybe start with that number, because
Oh, yeah, we'll start with this
that's
number.
kind of like the,
This is the other executive summary right here. Yeah, this is the
Right
other
there.
number. So,
because when we're talking budget, it's like, in my mind, what's the number? What's the budget?
okay, so the total annual inflow and outflow range right there is 16.7 is the lower end, and that's what we recommend because of the consumptive use and all that. But it could be the higher, but that's the lower end. But when we say outflow, remember, this is near the powerhouse and all the spring. This is not the Colorado River. That's critical because a lot of people have that. That's a different number and that's a different thing. Our outflow is the Pack Creek inflow. Okay, so our 16.7, this is very important from water rights.
The 16.7 is the total outflow, and that includes
Right.
Mill Creek outflow towards
Right.
the valley, as well the springs flow to the valley, as well as Kens Lake's diversion to the valley, as well as the evaporation of the plants in our system along the streams. Those are basically the main, and of course the wells. Those are the main outflows. So if you take Kens Lake out of there, you get in the order of 12,500 instead of 16,700.
And Moab City, like, doesn't ever use Kens Lake water?
Well, I'm not the person to answer that, but...
So our budget is 12?
They don't divert all the time year-round. They only divert certain parts of the year.
So it's complicated.
I think the short
It is a bit complicated, but I want to say that
12 to 16-ish.
we discussed it with Chuck, and basically we are what is possible, maybe not technical, but at least from a water budget point of view, available for the city is in the range from 6,000 to 8,000.
What? Say that again?
6,000 to 8,000?
6,000 to 8,000
Acre feet per year, out of the Glen Canyon system.
What? Wait, that seems, what? Wait, so,
Because you lose about, just roughly, 4,000 to Kens Lake that you cannot touch for your wells and springs, because it is in the lower system and the wells do not draw on it. You lose about, I think, 4,000 to 6,000 from the vegetation in our area.
Oh, that much.
That much.
That much.
That much.
And so when you subtract those two numbers from the 16,000, you get in the order of 6,000 to 8,000.
6,000 to 8,000. That's what's left.
That is left
for development.
in the groundwater system. Well, technically,
In the
you know, by using the current wells, you cannot access all that water.
Wait, is ground flow outflow? I thought we were talking outflow number, but then you just said ground flow.
Here, let's go back to
Is that the same?
how to go backwards here.
So there's groundwater and then outflow. What's ground flow?
Hold on.
Or did I not hear you correctly?
Let's get the table up here.
Sorry, I didn't.
No.
Didn't
Yeah.
get the Masters of Science in this
This
one.
water budget is for all the water, not just the groundwater.
Here's your table.
surface water plus groundwater.
Surface water plus groundwater that comes in, and surface water and groundwater that comes out. Because basically, if you just look at what the groundwater that comes out, that is the wells and the springs. But in the system, you have an interaction between what is going in the surface system, that's going through Mill Creek and the North Fork and so, and what is in the groundwater. Parts of the creeks leak, parts of the creek gain from groundwater. The other part, big part, the major part, of the inflow is recharge. So you have two big pieces of water that comes into the system, and that is recharge from precipitation and the inflow in Mill Creek above the Shealy diversion. We do that above the Shealy diversion to just show how important the Shealy diversion is with respect to how the amount of water that is available in the system.
Can I ask a dummy question? Is aquifer water ground flow?
Groundwater flow. So aquifer water basically is groundwater, as we call it. And then groundwater, that's always flowing, so it's groundwater flow. So that happens in an aquifer. Aquifer is just the name of that porous rock through which water flows.
Okay.
And as basically, at the moment you look at the spring, it's always, when my youngest was about 8 years old, and I tried to explain groundwater, and I say, look, there's groundwater. He says, it's not in the ground, it's coming out of the ground. So, but anyhow, that is groundwater that is coming to the surface and becomes surface water. But at the moment, as long as it is in the ground, in the rock, it's called groundwater. It's just a definition that we use. And so, because it's always flowing, we are very much interested in groundwater flow because it tells us how fast it can go and how fast pollutants can go with groundwater and things like that.
So check out this table here. Here's the preliminary post-development water budget for low phreatophytes. So this means phreatophytes aren't working as hard, so to speak. And there's your 16 that we start with. So here's what's coming out at the gauge, say the powerhouse, 5317. That's what we give to the Pack Creek system. Okay, that's what Mill Creek finally puts into the Pack Creek system right there. Here's Shealy diversion, that's spoken for, right? So that's out of our system, that's been taken out. Here's the domestic consumptive use Paul was talking about, 120. So we can add the Mill Creek outflow to the domestic use. Here's the municipal, add that, add the springs, right? Ignore the consumptive use. If you add those three numbers into the 5,000, that's what's really available.
Okay.
So,
Doesn't include, well,
Mayor,
this does have storage as an output, but that's what is already on its way out at this point.
So a comment from Mike.
Yeah,
and
just
then I
one more
wanna-
than one.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll quit. So this sheet's a little hokey in my opinion, or in a bit, because on the input side, you've got recharge from precip, which I think you would acknowledge has a big error band associated with it.
Yeah.
You don't really know the recharge. I mean, what percentage would you care to estimate the accuracy of that recharge number?
Well, I think you may have a range from,
20 to
I
40.
would go, I
I
would
mean, 20%,
not-
50%? I mean,
Yeah, maybe 15 to 20%.
that's fine. And
But
then,
especially to the lower side. So you may not see much more, but it may be less.
okay, that's fine. And then similarly, you have a big number out there for
Vegetation. Shealy.
consumptive use of, what am I trying to say? On the downhill side.
On the right side, vegetation.
Oh, you're right.
4,009.
Yeah, 4,009. So you've got
That's low estimate.
that's another number with a big error band.
It could be much higher.
Could be much
It
higher.
could be, that's the low end of the research. The high end, in fact, we do have the high end.
And you have better confidence on the rest of the numbers.
Yeah,
So
there was
magically,
another
I mean,
chart
you
that was
balance
high,
these
yeah.
two, somehow magically you managed to balance these two big noisy columns to make them come out magically equal. And I'm wondering how much confidence you have. I mean, to say 873 acre feet down to 3 significant places is a bit misleading, right? Because I maintain that you really don't have that much confidence in some of your big heavy hitters on the input side and on the output side.
Well, yeah, you know, there's always a difficult choice to make. We make these calculations in the spreadsheet, as we just briefly showed, and that we need to be able to justify it with the rates. If we start rounding off, then the scientific reviewers and the technical reviewers may have a problem with our, so we qualified the uncertainties in those text bullets, and they are much more elaborate in our report, the uncertainties about it and our suggestions how to improve on this. That's why we call it a preliminary budget. So you should not be, you know, too much hang up on that change of storage number, for example.
I agree.
It may be that we are in about zero. It may be that it is higher.
Exactly, and I'm not complaining, gentlemen, mind you. I think you did as good a job with what you had that you can do.
Yeah.
The point is that there's still much that we don't know, and I think you're correct, not for me to get too hung up on 800 acre feet one way or the other, but so I will stop.
So I just wanted to give you, Jeff, an introduction and an opportunity to bring that microphone close to you and say, hi.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to Moab, and welcome to being our new water lawyer.
Glad to be here.
We've been talking about you or this position for quite a while.
Okay.
So thanks for saying yes.
Yeah.
What
Glad
do
to
you
be
think
here.
about- What do you think about all this?
Well, I didn't come down with, I wasn't asked to come down with a specific presentation. What I was asked to do was give the city's water rights a quick look, just to see kind of what shape they're in, maybe some ideas of what Chuck and I and others can work on to improve them. Obviously, the goal here is to maximize and protect the city's water rights to the extent possible, particularly with these general adjudications happening through the court system with the state. So I'm happy to, if you guys want to tell me what you want to hear from me, I'm happy to, you know, ask or answer whatever you have. But
Actually, just participate in part of this discussion, maybe on the results that Ken is providing would be helpful.
okay. Yeah, just to, I should start by saying I think the city staff and others who've been in charge of the water rights should be commended. The water rights are in quite good shape. I've looked at water rights for a lot of cities. Sometimes they're not in very good shape. Sometimes they haven't been thought about for a long time or looked at or really understood for a long time. That certainly doesn't seem to be the case here. I think that's due in large part to people's doing a good job on it. I think the adjudication has also helped be kind of a push to make sure that the city's water rights are up to snuff, and they do appear to be. I've got some ideas that I'll probably talk with Chuck later about of some things we can do to even make them better. But by and large, they're in very good shape, I think. So if you add up the city's water rights, and I guess I'll start by saying there's two limitations on water rights when you're talking about how much water you can take. One is a flow limitation, which is how much water you can take at any given time. That's the maximum flow. The other one is the diversion limit in terms of volume, which is how much water you can take in a given year. And so the way I analogize this is if you think about a swimming pool, you have a swimming pool and you have a hose to fill it up with. And the hose is your volume or your flow. That's how much you can take. You may have a small garden hose. You may have a large fire hose. But that's how fast you can take the water, and then the pool is how much water you can take. Once the pool is full for the year, you are done taking water. And a lot of the older water rights, when it comes to old irrigation rights, they may have very large flows, but fairly small volumes. And the reason why is, you know, back in the old days when you would flood irrigate, you can't just have a small amount of water for a long period of time where it never really gets anywhere, right? So they would take large volumes of water, push the water across the field to get it watered. You know, they may do that for a couple days or however long it takes, and then they wouldn't water for a while, and then they do it again. So you see, you know, they may have a very large flow, but they don't have very large volume. With city water rights, they're a little bit different. City water rights have a special designation called municipal use. And with municipal use, the way a lot of the city water rights, including a lot of Moab City's water rights, the way they were established is just as flow rights. So the state said, you know, the city would file and say, we want to take 1 CFS from our well, and the state would say, great, go ahead, and the city would drill a well, and they would show that they could take 1 CFS out of that well. And once they were allowed to do that, then the city would, or the state would say, all right, you have a water right to take 1 CFS from your well. And if you do the math, if you take 1 CFS 24/7 all year long, it comes out to 723.97 acre feet per year. But that assumes you're taking,
You just impressed us, I think.
Yeah, 2
Well-
decimal places too, yeah, wow.
Yeah, thank you.
okay, we'll do 724, just to round things off.
Good.
But that assumes the city takes 1 CFS 24/7
Right.
all year long. And so when you look at some of the city's water rights, if you do the math and convert them from their flow rights to their volume rights, it comes up with a big number. But you have to keep in mind that's assuming, you know, equal distribution across the whole year. Of course, that's, anybody who deals with water tells you that's not how water's used. Water's low in the winter, and then it goes up and hits its peak day in usually the hottest day in July, and then goes back down, right? And so even if the city has the volume under its water rights to meet the demand, it also needs to make sure it has the flow to meet those demands on the peak days. And so, you know, again, looking at the city's water rights, if you add up the, as I looked at the diversion limits, the flows add up to 14.3 and change CFS. And if you do the math on acre feet, it comes out to about 9,600 acre feet. So it seems like, you know, 96 acre feet sounds like a lot. It is a lot, particularly compared to I think the city's using about 2,000 acre feet per year right now. But again, you have to factor in that you can't just say, well, that means we can, you know, quadruple in size and be fine because you have that flow limitation. You have to worry about exactly when you're getting your water. I recently helped another city just a couple weeks ago. They were looking at the same thing. It looked like they had a large amount of water, and they do. But when you factor in, and it looks like they have more water than they really need for future growth, but when you factor in that flow limitation, they actually don't have enough. And so, but by and large, it looks like, you know, the city has a good inventory of water rights. They're in good condition. And then obviously the next factor is, you know, does the source produce that water? And is it sustainable to take that amount of water? And so that's where these gentlemen come in and to help you figure out those numbers.
Thank you. That was a lot for not being prepared to make a presentation.
Well, I can talk more. I spent 3 hours teaching a water law class this morning, so I've already been talking about water law today, and that's all I do all day, every day, so I should be able to talk about it on a
Well,
moment's
we're so
notice.
excited to have you
Thank you.
and have your professional help as we navigate
Yeah.
these waters.
I'm happy to, if anybody has any questions about if anybody's happy to answer anything or ask anything about the general adjudication process or anything like that, I'm happy to answer any questions in that regard too.
I think we will have questions, but
So we have a groundwater management plan coming up, state sponsors in another year or so. So you might well end up participating in that.
Yeah, they've done groundwater management plans in different parts of the state. There's a wide variety of, you know, when you say groundwater management plan, they're not all the same. They're wild, or they vary wildly of what a groundwater management plan does. I mean, in general, the idea is let's manage the groundwater so we don't mine it, as was discussed. But the mechanisms that they do that, the calculations they look at, you know, the groundwater management an actual plan can look very different depending on where it is and what the division determines, both in terms of the calculations as well as what they think should be done to manage the groundwater.
so part of why this council is so, I'll say excited to have your report and have you on board is that we're having a big conversation about development and, you know, toilets and sinks and showers and development and what those implications are of our valley and our water budget. So we received a list from Nora, our planning director, that lists, did anybody add these up? How many units or how many rooms that these, that the vested nightly rentals that we already have in store coming. We're in a moratorium right now to answer this and future land use map questions. And so the magic question for me is always like, how much more growth can we experience in our valley? How much water, how much water do we have to support the further development of our valley?
Right. And again, from a water rights perspective, which, again, in our industry, we have what we call paper water, which is how much water you're
Paper
allowed
water
to
and
take.
actual water.
And wet water.
So we just need to know from the paper and the wet,
Right.
like, what's our boundary?
What's your boundary here? Right.
And again, from a paper perspective, from a water rights perspective, the city has room to grow. They've got an inventory of water rights that they build up. The state allows cities to hold water for future use. It wasn't too many years ago, there was a lawsuit. Well, let me back up. In Utah, if you don't use your water for 7 years, it's subject to forfeiture. Obviously, we're the second driest state. Using water is important, so if you're not going to use your water, then somebody else should be allowed to use it, because the state holds all the water. They're just granting you a right to use some of the state's water. Wasn't too many years ago, there was a lawsuit where someone claimed a certain city wasn't using all of its water rights and should therefore forfeit its water. And that wasn't looked on very well, because a lot of people said, well, we know people are going to continue having babies. We know people are going to continue to move here. Cities are going to grow. We should allow cities to hold water for future use and basically be an exception to that rule that they have to use every drop of water, or lose it. And so the legislature passed a law in 2008 that allows cities to hold water for reasonable future use, which is defined as the next 40 years. And that's a rolling number. And so, what we want to, when we're looking at, from a water rights perspective of, what can the city hold, that's what the limit is the 40-year.
But our water rights are not just, we're not just talking the budget that we're looking at with Mill Creek, right? Like we're talking Colorado River rights to that water as well, correct?
I'm not aware of any Colorado River rights.
No?
Oh, none?
I don't think we have any.
Well, the reason why I asked that is because what I've heard from, the San Juan County, that they are trying to grow a community of 15,000 people. And what we've heard is, well, that's okay, because if we use all the water, if we prove it and we're using it, then Moab City can just pull out of the Colorado. I've heard
As far as
that.
I'm aware, you don't have any rights to take out of the river right now.
I think we do, or if I'm not mistaken, and some of you other guys, Arnie, you correct me if I thought we did have some, but we're not using them because it's expensive and we don't have a place to put it for right now. The other part of that.
All the smarty pants in the room are shaking their heads, no, we don't have rights to pull water from the Colorado. I should actually call you all usual suspects, but.
May I ask you a question? So
Yes.
the other community that you worked with, you were able to determine the flow that they had, or that was?
Yeah, so what we were working on is what's called a 40-year plan. That's the plan you put together to show what you will need in 40 years to justify the water rights that the city is holding for future use. And so that one, the goal of that was to see, does the city need the water that it has? And the answer to that was yes, because again, even though in volume it looked like they had more than they needed, when it came to flow, they didn't have enough. And so that was the circumstance that we were looking at in that case, was seeing if they really needed all the water that they had for future growth.
So are you going to be able to give us a flow and volume number, or is that like between just?
Well, yeah,
The
for what the
actual
city
paper.
has, I mean, I have that for what the city's water rights are. When it comes to those 40-year plans, usually those are prepared by engineers who look at it, the city's expected growth patterns, and also look at comparing flow in terms of volume. And so it's usually engineers that prepare that 40-year plan with us, assisting, providing the data on the water rights.
So is that our next step?
Yeah, and I want to ask a question on that.
Yeah.
What you heard is only half the system or thereabouts, because this is the Glen Canyon aquifer, which goes to the city wells and springs and Skakel. The city has wells in the Spanish Valley too. And we didn't do that part yet.
Right.
And so that's another whole set of storage and other calculations in there. And from a physics point of view, the city may have to tap that to get up to the amount of water it needs so it doesn't kill its other system.
Yeah.
You see what
And
I'm
again,
saying?
I didn't, when I was doing my analysis, I didn't break it out by the different
Right.
system. I was just looking at the
Oh,
totality.
no. I wanted her to,
Yeah.
and everybody else to
But this
understand
is the
that.
good water,
This is the good water in terms of culinary.
briny.
Well, it depends on where it is, because Chuck, you might want to comment
Oily.
on Phoenix water versus whatever. Because the quality is potable in the Spanish Valley, right? I mean, it's just,
Just when you look at the numbers, it's different than.
Microphone. Chris is not using his.
I'm sorry, we were talking. What's the question?
is it potable?
Yeah, the
Well-
quality of the, not the Glen Canyon, but
The Pack Creek.
The Pack
Pack
Well,
Creek
it's
water.
not as good as the Glen Canyon, but Arnie really knows more about it. We talked about it yesterday. It's saltier, right? But, so compared to the good water that we drink, we don't want it. But could we use it for irrigation? Yes.
And we are using it for irrigation.
Yeah, I mean, and and I'm not proposing this, but if we had an irrigation system in the city using Pack Creek water, then we wouldn't be using Glen Canyon water for irrigating lawns. Just a thought.
Are we pumping Glen Canyon water out to drink it and use it, or is it gravity fed coming out?
We use springs, and our system's springs and wells, right? So when the springs come out, we pump it up into our distribution tanks.
Yeah.
Then we pump it into our system, our distribution system. And from the wells, we pump them out of the ground, put it into the tanks, and then the water's distributed out of the tanks.
And it depends on time of year.
Yeah,
Because right now, we're just springing.
yeah, in the winter, a lot of times, 3 months out of the year, we're just running off of springs,
Paul and,
in the winter.
Paul and Ken, I had a question about the uncertainties and recommendations. So I noticed in the uncertainties section on the water budget, there's a note up front that says there's a need and there's planning happening for further analysis. So I didn't know, is there like a timeline on that, or is that an ongoing thing? I think it was just generally stated there are many uncertainties and the preliminary calculations of further analysis is needed and planned. And I didn't know, is that a long-term thing, or does that come with phase 3?
We would like to see a number of additional field measurements.
I did see the notes about monitoring
and
surface
and
water system.
especially continuous measurement in the sense of maybe Mill Creek measuring it and 4 or more times a year.
Yeah.
And also some of the larger springs that are not city springs and are not being monitored right now, to get a number of, and I would almost say as a monthly reading on the flows coming from those springs, because those would give us a handle if we know what a larger spring does over the year, then we also can estimate better what the other springs are doing over the year, because they will respond about the same way to rain events and potentially to increased flow in Mill Creek, for example.
Yeah, like I read the section about more frequent monitoring at some of Blanchard stations. So I guess one of my questions for Chuck and Joel or the council is that built into our budget? Is that something we need to add if it's something we're interested in doing?
Monitoring stations, no, we do not have that built into our budget, right?
And it's something we need to review. Chuck and I have been out with Levi and some of the water and reviewed the system pretty heavy. There is redundancies that need to be built into it.
Yeah, you recall in the 5-year draft CIP that we presented, we talked about a replacement well or an additional well. And we, I believe, do have money in this year's budget to study, site, and design that well.
Yeah, we have prioritized.
Is that the storage well you're talking about? Or
It's an
Spanish
additional
Valley,
ground,
Spanish
it's an additional well, yeah.
Okay.
Is it possible to, I mean, is it easy to find out, like, how much it costs to do that additional monitoring, the surface monitoring? No.
Yeah, we're contributing right now with the USGS gauge on Mill Creek, right, Eric? On an annual basis? Yeah. You may remember. Yeah, we're doing it now. I forget what the number is. It might be $5,000 a year.
I think that's correct, yeah.
Gauge.
Wells 6 and 10, the two heavy hitters in the city system, as Jeff alluded to, are we already up against the CFS limits in our water rights?
I'd have to look.
Good question.
It's a good question, but I don't think so. Those are our heavy hitters. They're running, I want to say it's 1,000. I'd have to look, to be honest with you.
I don't know that either, but as we've had those discussions and we've talked about the outputs and we've talked about what we need to do to build redundancy, that's never once come up. So that leads me to want to tell you no, but I don't know that. And I would think that if we were at those limits, that would have been brought up in the conversations that we've had.
And Jeff, if I may clarify, I don't know, stop me if you already know all this. The mayor alluded to San Juan counties and their 15,000 person community out there, which a lot of people here would rather not deal with. They have, as you may know, back in 2011, and they refreshed it not long ago, very junior water rights to 5,000 acre feet. And they wanted to do points of diversion in the upper end of the Spanish Valley out here. 20 some odd points. They got one well in that they've already operated for a while. But they also have alternative points of diversion on the Colorado River. Just like, forgive me, I know either the city or the county has some rights to the river, but I'm not sure which. But anyway, San Juan County, if the wells out here in this aquifer don't work out without sucking down other people's wells because they have junior water rights, they can always get it out of the river, assuming those are wet water rights now, and that's a whole nother story. But it would be very expensive for them because they got to bring it up all the way up from the river.
Pump it and treat it, yeah.
King Creek, I think.
And treat it.
Yeah,
Be a big deal for them.
that would be.
Can I just ask the three of you too, just in terms of climate change, is there a standard either percentage or formula, if you wanted as a community to plan out 40 years, does the state, allow you to calculate that in, or is that all based on what the engineer calculates anyway, and then it would be based on consultation from a hydrologist on how you should help calculate that? Just because it seems like that's something we're facing. I don't know how it's going to affect, these numbers.
I would say, this, right now, we don't have, we didn't look in it right now because that was not the question.
Yeah.
The main two changes, either if you get more snow or more precipitation or less, will be related to, the major changes will be related to recharge, the use of water by plants, and the inflow from Mill Creek from the La Salle Mountains. How much, if you are concerned with that for a 40-year plan, I think that there are already studies that give some indication for this area what the future and how certain those projections are. We don't have looked into that, so I don't know exactly where to find it, but that is possible.
But what I did do is when I reviewed the USGS draft, we looked at the wells they had both in the Glen Canyon and in the Pack Creek system. And the Glen Canyon system got its boost in 1981, right, when they came on. But it has a percentage decline, and I have to go back and look at my review, but it might be 5% over the last 30 years. And we looked at the non-Glen Canyon affected wells, the ones that were out of the Ken's Lake thing, and they were already declining, and they declined at the same rate. So there are wells, it's in that report, which is not out yet, but they have a nice figure in there. And I can go back to my review and I can send you Chuck has it too, which we sent on to them because I don't know if they saw it as a significant conclusion, but we did. We looked at their data and we said, you've got this, you ought to talk about it. So.
Kaylin's got something.
So, as I understand it, a certain amount of in-stream flow is required to be maintained in Mill Creek. Do you think that that is adequate to maintain the city production and to whatever extent Mill Creek stream from Shelley is recharging the storage? Or do you think that that is potentially decreasing city production and sustainability?
No, I'll fill in mine, go for it.
I'm a bit hesitant to say yes or no on that question, because we really have to look at the area of the city, springs and wells, in detail to see how much they are dependent on recharge of the aquifer from Mill Creek versus the recharge from the local recharge in the area. So at this moment, I'm not sure if it is if we are at the edge of what we can do, and if more pumping is feasible or not. But it's something we can look into.
Okay.
Can I ask?
Chuck? No.
Oh, I'm
Wait,
sorry.
Chuck wants to say something.
Just in the interest of where we're going next, I wanted to just check in with council. This is a preliminary report. The Water Conservation Board has given us some comments both on phase 1 and phase 2, which are going to be addressed. So that's in the works. We're also proposing to go ahead and have this peer reviewed by the Utah Geological Society, which is good in terms of establishing the veracity of the study regarding future use of the study by the city. The other thing we were going to do is work on scoping a proposal to look at the Valley Fill Aquifer or the Pack Creek Aquifer from these gentlemen, just because it seems like in our best interests to do so. And then the last thing is that we will also talk, I was going to talk in further detail with Jeff about the 40-year plan. That also seems to be a prudent action for us to move forward and on those, and I wanted to check in to see if council thought those were all good things for us to be doing.
Yeah, well, let me respond to that, because I kind of have my little to-do list scratches that I wanted to address. So first of all, there's the moment of we're in a moratorium and this council needs to be informed about what our, so when I heard budget, I was like, great, we're going to know how much water we have, how much we're going to approve. And here's some quick numbers. So 595 units of hotel that are vested, that are online to happen if we say no more hotel growth, plus lines back, plus any additional housing or commercial development, plus what if somebody builds another car wash or other high-use water thing. So we right now need to be informed so that we can make an informed decision on future land use planning. I don't know, what I'm hearing from you with peer review and the 40-year plan and other policy, like long-term policy implications, that's very helpful. Also, I remember a conversation that I had with Cara about gauges and monitoring more areas and making sure that we're budgeting for water gauge stuff. And I think Ronnie was kind of alluding to that as well. So it's important that that not just be, on a shelf somewhere, but that's activated in our budget and in our brains. We're going to need policy guidance for maintaining our quality and quantity. And so, but for like right now, like what can we do? What can this council do to get from all of these very smart people guidance on how while we're in this moratorium? Because that's important.
Mayor, those are great points, and I'm just curious if do we add the numbers that Grand County is also vested in? I mean, it is the same.
Plus Grand County.
I mean, it's the same valley. So, what was that?
Would you like the Conservation Board to address that in our next meeting?
Yeah. I mean, can we get is that the right vector to get like what we need is a real deal recommendation, like a 3-sentence with some boundaries recommendation.
What's the time frame?
What?
Would we work for you?
I would say.
Come, we talk microphone. Come on. Because let's just get this, let's just do this, right?
It depends to a large degree on, in my opinion, I think Chuck and city staff having, having the time to give us the information, and if the correct path for that to go is through the Water Conservation and Drought Advisory Board, or whatever that acronym is, back to staff or council, or if it's that staff handles it and we talk with them a bit at the next meeting. I don't know how that proper procedure should be. It certainly is something we can talk about. It's what we've been talking about to a large degree. And just, seeing this for the first time, we saw this at our last meeting last week, and we can talk about it at the next meeting. I know the timeline is very,
When is your
very
next
short.
meeting?
The 12th of June, I think.
Second Wednesday.
Yeah, I think it's the 12th of June.
Well, because we're like
I know.
we're reviewing policy right now.
I know, and that's why I'm questioning if we're the right venue or if it should just be sitting with city staff. Because I think Chuck and his staff can react faster than we can.
Paul,
Knowing what you, sorry. Knowing what I think you want now, which are some guidance numbers, I think we can quickly work with these gentlemen, the Conservation Board, Joel, and come up with some recommendations for you that may not be as rock solid as in a year as they would, for the
Bumpers.
things, but it'd be good enough to give you what I think you're looking for. Yeah, we can.
And Karen's right too. Like, I did not list Grand County use, and it should absolutely be there.
That one's going to be a little more difficult just because we don't have the detailed hydrology done on that. I mean, there's some draft USGS stuff, but we can take a stab at it. I mean, but Grand County should really, they should almost represent themselves. I'd hate to kind of represent them without having the opportunity to really work with them for that.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I don't want to set up an adversarial relationship
No, but
necessarily.
but we gotta think about we gotta be all systems thinking.
But we can work offline. It doesn't have to, if that's okay with Cara and the board, to work with some of those folks. We know them all. We can work with them.
Recognizing we're also in May.
Right, and I think the other thing that I think you could use the meetings that the Water Conservation Board has online in the time frame that you have is if you're getting draft ideas of how you might take those numbers that reflect your boundaries of acceptable use, to then look at, well, what does that mean in terms of, like, there's these 4 different policy suggestions. Well, then I think that could be a good body to look at that and go, well, hang on, let's weigh through this a little bit. So, looking to Chuck and his staff for more the technical, getting through the numbers, because honestly, you don't want us sitting there trying to number crunch in a committee.
Yeah.
What you want is real numbers coming to us, and then ideas that have come from planning staff and others of what can you do with that. And then I think we could have some good solid ideas of what that might look like.
Yeah.
And going, all right, here's these 6 different options, here's how we rank them, and here's why.
Well, Landmark has published the 5-option,
No, yeah, right.
and there could be, that could be helpful for
Could
the
link the
board
2
to.
together.
Yeah.
And then, I think another potential venue for tying all that together too could be planning staff and planning commission. And just getting, when you get numbers and you get some ideas of how does this all fit together, here's what we're thinking. Because I think that's a good time to have additional eyes looking at it and saying, well, yeah, this makes sense, or hang on, you forgot about this. I think that's where it could be very useful.
Yeah. Nora's nodding, yes. Good. Okay, so thank you. It's 6:47. We should probably take a break before 7. Any final thoughts? Thank you so much for the presentation and for coming and the engagement. This was a really healthy conversation. Thank you all. Take a break, come back at 7.
Have you had it? It's like cookie butter? Oh,
No.
The 40-year plan is to meet
tomorrow morning, you need me? Or us?
For the next 40 years. So the city wants to keep all the water it has in its inventory. It needs to show that it's going to need it, because if the city has
Are we muted
an acre in its inventory,
Yeah, I'm fine.
We'll make it at 10.
then someone could come
If
and
we get out here by noon, that'll get us in by 5 or 6.
So are we,
No snow
are
is
we
passes
still
that I know of.
live? So we want to stop the live feed
See you at
and then start it again.
Joel, we're just still live, everybody.